charts. There we go. Okay. I first started thinking about cities a little more than 7 years ago as I was leaving the Department of Energy and thinking about what my next gig would be. And the combination of cities and data at that time, and still does, seem irresistible. Cities are important, as we've heard. There are ample technological developments that say we can better understand them and presumably improve them. So I was able, given the opportunity to do this actually, as part of standing up the Center for Urban Science and Progress, which was an initiative that NYU started at the behest of Mayor Bloomberg, bringing tech to New York City. There is the announcement just about 7 years ago. The mayor is, let's see, do we have a pointer here? I guess we do. There's the mayor, John Sexton, who was at the time the president of NYU, and there I was in the background because we had no idea what we were actually going to do. And in the 7 years since, we sort of figured out a lot of this, at least from an academic perspective. And so what I'm going to do is tell you about some of the technologies that we've demonstrated and in some cases deployed in New York City in an effort to make it somewhat smarter. I came in with asking myself the question, I'm a scientist, and so for me, the first step is let's go measure something. What does it mean to instrument a city? And there are three buckets. We've heard them today already in various parsings. The infrastructure. I want to know about the condition and operation of the roads, the grid, the buildings, and so on. Not only the operation and condition, but also the planning of them is important. The second is the environment, not only the obvious pollution and meteorology, but the noise, the light, the flora and fauna that exist in the city. And then finally, most problematically, but most interestingly, the people. Cities are built for people, and we need to include them integrally in the description of what we're trying to do. We want to know the relationships, the location, the economic and communications activities, health, nutrition, opinions, or you can go on and on. There are, of course, immense privacy issues associated with this that we will get to in a bit. But the thesis is that if we can properly acquire, integrate, and analyze data like this, then we can take government beyond the present imperfect understanding, better and more efficient operations, better planning, better policy. We can improve governance and citizen engagement so citizens can really understand what's happening in their cities. We can enable the private sector to do great things. And then we can also change the social sciences, taking it to a large-scale observational activity rather than surveys of a few people or controlled studies in a laboratory. That was, and still is, largely the vision. The first thing you realize is that there is a lot of data out there. And we've heard a lot about in situ sensors, but there's a lot more than that. There are organic data flows. There are administrative records that the city develops in the course of it doing its business. Census permits. There's economic data about transactions and communications. There's the operational data, and of course, social media these days. Then there are sensors. We all carry sensors in our pockets. We can do fixed in situ sensors of the kind that we just heard about, and I'll have more to say about some of that. We can crowdsource from sensing, and of course at choke points, whether they're toll gates or building entrances and so on, are wonderful places to watch the flow of stuff, people, and so on. And then there are novel technologies, and I'm going to concentrate a lot on this because we are a research organization at CUSP, and part of our job is to develop and demonstrate novel technologies. There's all kinds of imagery, LiDAR, gravitational and magnetic sensing, seismic, acoustic, ionizing, and you can go down the list if you're a technologist. And the challenge is to develop and deploy these in an economic and efficient way in a city, and then acquire the data, understand the patterns, and see how it can lead to better understanding and hopefully improvement of the city. So some of the research themes that we developed over the last 7 years are energy and environment, social services. I won't have much to say about that, but it's obviously important to understand how people are using the shelters, for example, for homeless in New York City. How are people being trained, job patterns, and so on. Mobility, obviously, event and pattern detection, you'll see that one of the dominant features of cities is their diurnal pulse. And can we quantify that? Can we look for anomalies? And of course, environment and air quality. Security is, of course, another theme that we've heard about today as well. Here's an example. It's now a bit out of date, but Bloomberg, being the data-oriented guy that he is, aggregated all of New York City's data together, or at least a lot of it. This is what's called DataBridge, or was. It was the mayor's attempt to collect centrally data feeds from so many different agencies. This is the housing police. This is Department of Transportation, Fire, Department of Buildings, et cetera, et cetera. And like most big organizations, there were hardly any folks there who had the time or skills to be able to analyze it all. And so it is, a lot of it is publicly accessible. You can go to databridge.nyc, but it's a dog's breakfast, and there's a lot of work to just clean it up and then try to do something with it. So a lot of what we did was based on this, at least for the records part of things. Federal records should not be ignored either. This is a map of the Gini Index, which measures income inequality, and I show it not so much for the data itself, but you can see the resolution with which we can map the human terrain in at least the developed cities and understand the background on which the city plays out every day. All right, records show you a little bit about building energy efficiency. Probably 7 or 8 years ago, New York City passed a local law mandating that all large buildings had to self-report their annual energy use, electricity, gas, heating oil, steam, and so on. This is a histogram of the energy use intensity for office buildings in New York City. There are about 1,150 buildings here. And what's interesting is you see all buildings are not the same. Some buildings use as much as 5 times the energy per square foot as other buildings. There are reasons for that. Some of it is the activity in buildings. For example, broadcast studios and hospitals run more or less around the clock and so use a lot of energy. But it also depends on building type, building operation, and so on. And understanding that is essential if you're going to try to reduce energy usage or make it more efficient. The same sort of data for apartment buildings, multifamily buildings. It looks a little bit more regular, as you might imagine, but still, factors are 2 or 3. Some buildings are brick, some buildings are glass wall, and you got to try to understand those differences. Here's an example from Constantine Contacosta and his collaborators. Constantine is a faculty member at NYU who's affiliated with the center. They had access to a network of about 20 Wi-Fi access points deployed around Water Street in Lower Manhattan. And even though your phone might not be connecting to a Wi-Fi access point, it certainly pings it if the Wi-Fi is turned on. And so they were able to get an analysis, or the SSIDs, of the phones of passers-by. And this is a plot over about a month in July. And what you see already is the diurnal pattern. Here are 4 days of the week. This was the July 4th weekend. It goes down and so on. And you see a double peak every workday associated with people arriving and departing, and then the lunchtime as well. It's actually a triple peak, sorry. You see July 4th, Monday there was down. And more interestingly, by keeping track of those pings that they saw every day during working hours, those pings that they only saw once and never again, and then those pings that they saw every day at odd hours, you can separate out passers-by from visitors and so on. And so you can get a nice sense of the pulse of the city in a very non-permissive sort of way. Here's a camera example. We heard about how many cameras in China? 200 million plus. New York City's only got about 200 traffic cameras, but they are public feeds, and so you can tap into them at 30-second cadences. If you're the city, of course, you have much faster video rates, but Greg Dobler and his collaborators tapped into a couple of the traffic cameras. Some of them have this sort of Abbey Road scene where you've got a crosswalk in them. Others don't. And then you can train up a neural net, as they did, to simply count the number of pedestrians in the frame. and you can do this routinely, automatically, and so on. It's not a perfect neural net, but it's good enough for the purposes of what they were trying to do. And then you can start to make plots. This is just ordering by cameras number. This is time of day, and you can see weekdays versus weekends, that there are different patterns in pedestrian counts. Again, you can get a sense of the pulse of the city, weekdays, weekends. And then if you look, July 4th, for example, in this year, showed quite a bit of an anomalous behavior in those cameras relative to the weekdays. So these are ways of getting a sense of what we like to call the pulse of the city. It's data that's just out there for free. You don't have to put anything out. You just have to scrape it from the web. Let's do another example. This is a project called SONYC, Sounds of New York City, which is run by Juan Bello, a professor of music technology at NYU. And they have developed a box with an acoustically faithful microphone, good to plus or minus 2 dB. It exfiltrates through local Wi-Fi or cell system. It's about, let's see, it's less than $100, fabricated in bulk. They've got more than 100 of these boxes now deployed out there around New York City. There are interesting legal issues, which I can get into in recording, but needless to say, this is a technological bit of what's required. There's the deployment, an example. There's the box, the data cable, the windsock for the microphone, and as always, you run into unexpected problems, so they had to put pigeon spikes on the box as well. And so these are out there. You know, you get, let's say, a couple hundred audio streams. What are you going to do with that? It's easy enough to log the data. It's not that hard. But to actually make something of it is not so easy. And so they developed, this is an early version, of a machine listening algorithm. I don't know if we can play that audio now, which has been trained up on, so it categorizes the sounds. And there's the car horn. Let's see, did we lose the audio? All right. Let's set it. So both for privacy reasons and just for sheer scale, you've got to do this kind of feature extraction. It can, of course, be done in the box. It's not that hard to do. And so there we are. The Department of Environmental Protection is really interested in this. Noise is a public health problem. It affects real estate values, quality of life, and so on. And so if you can build a map or identify the violators of the noise code, the guys who bang the trash cans every morning at 2 o'clock in the morning, that would help a lot. All right, so good. All right, I'm going to spend a lot of time on what we like to call persistent synoptic imaging of cities, which is something that we pursued for the last 6 years or so, 6.5. I was inspired more than 7 years ago by this photo, which is a lower Manhattan scene, but done in the thermal infrared. And I pulled it out of National Geographic, and you start to look at it and you say, that's pretty interesting. Why is that interesting? Well, first of all, there are variations in a building. So we're looking at the heat, of course, rather than the light. I can read the thermostat of every apartment in that building. That's pretty interesting. I have correlative data. I know from city records that there's a data center in that building. And so it's hot on the bottom, the vents are hot on the top, and otherwise at night it's relatively unoccupied. And those buildings are New York City public housing project, and they're glowing like crazy, showing the terrible inefficiency of the heating system in the building. I live in NYU housing in Lower Manhattan, and it's got the same problem. So it's not just city buildings, but all the buildings in Manhattan have that issue. So let's think about that. Single sensor, right? I don't have to deploy 6,000 or 2 million or whatever the number is. Synoptic, I got broad coverage. You can see probably 100 buildings in this scene. It's non-permissive. I don't need to go in and install smart meters or whatever. I don't need to read people's thermostats directly. It's persistent, which is real interesting, okay? That means I don't have to do precise calibration. I can look at time variation. And then, of course, you can get high granularity. You can see down at the individual unit, whether it's residential or commercial. And so I got a couple of astronomers about 6 years ago, and I said, this is interesting, go try to do this. And we've done a lot since. I'm going to show you some examples. Let me just show you some of the data first. This is the view that we have from the observatory. It's a rooftop in Brooklyn looking into the lower east side of Manhattan. You see the East River in the front, and the Empire State Building in the back is 3.8 miles away. You get a sense of scale, and there are 1,000 buildings, mostly residential in the foreground and commercial in the background. Lots of projects. Detection of aerosol plumes, the heat, urban emissions. I'll show you some hyperspectral work that shows the stuff coming out of a city, electrical grid, traffic conflicts, lots of different things that are possible here. Again, some of it adapting the technologies and techniques from astronomy to do that. So let's start. You got to know what you're looking at. Fortunately, there is a LiDAR topography available of New York City. It's about a decade old, but it's still pretty good. 1 foot horizontal resolution, 1 foot vertical resolution. You can take that topography and fuse it with the image. And with a little bit of geometry, it was actually done by an undergraduate from Yale on a summer project, you can identify every pixel in the image and assign it a map coordinate. Once you have the map coordinate, you can access the New York City databases, because you know what building it is, that tells you all sorts of things about the building, what goes on there, how it's constructed, how many square feet, all that sort of thing. It's called Pluto, the Public Land Use and Tax Output. And so we can make this kind of image. The buildings are color-coded according to their energy use. So we have the energy use data. Also, we've outlined in black those buildings that are heated by oil rather than by gas, which is important for particulate pollution in New York City. So basically, we know what we're looking at. Here's a time-lapse video over a night of just in the visible. You can see the lights blinking on and off. Again, signatures of residential activity, commercial activity, and so on. You know, there's a lot of privacy discussion about this, as you might imagine. We keep the resolution low enough so that we can't see inside anybody's window. And also, we do all our analyses aggregate and de-anonymized so that there are no privacy concerns like that. I should remark that New York City has the highest per capita sales of binoculars and telescopes in the world. So, yeah, up to the right. Okay. Okay, let's go on to the next slide. So what do you learn from that? Well, the simplest thing to do, if we can go on to the next slide, is to just ask when do the lights go on and off. So I think we're going to loop. Can we go on to the next slide if you just click it? There we go. So there's an example of a couple of thousand lights. When do they turn on and when do they turn off over 21 days? And again, you see a pretty repetitive pattern. What you learn from this is it's a good proxy for energy consumption, occupation, sleep cycle, and so on. If we can click again. Oh, I've got the clicker, sorry. This is the actual energy consumption as measured by Con Ed in the buildings, and you see there's a pretty good correlation between what we observe from the externals of the building and what the meters are actually showing. So if the energy company won't give you the data, as is often the case, there are other ways of getting at it remotely. Sleep-wake rhythms, I'm not going to go into detail. It turns out people in aggregate are remarkably predictable about when they go to sleep. At the micro level, they're not. And we had some ground truth from Jawbone. Jawbone takes their data, this is a Fitbit sensors, fitness sensors, and can calculate who's sleeping in New York City when, and we got a pretty good match from just the lights themselves. I would mark the blue line is for the city as a whole, the orange line is for just the buildings in Manhattan we were looking at, and Manhattan tends to stay up later than the outer boroughs anyway, so we think it's pretty good. Soot plumes. A big source of pollution in New York City is the use of heating oil, heavy heating oil, in some fraction of the buildings. We set up a camera just watching and taking frames once every 10 seconds. The bottom is a loop of a couple minutes, background subtracted, and you can see every time the loop goes through, you get that big cloud of stuff coming up. We've colored it in red in the visible image up on top, and it's that. Okay. Not good. Biggest source of particulates in the city, more than the diesel trucks. And clearly, if you're responsible for environmental protection, you can do this. We've got a project. The AI to do this is not so easy because the background is variegated. But nevertheless, you'd like to know who's doing it, where is it going, how often is it happening, and so on. Let me show you this one. It's another energy one. You can buy for about $70,000 a shortwave hyperspectral imager. So for those of you who are not techies, your camera takes a picture in 3 colors, red, green, and blue. This takes a picture in about 800 colors, spanning the visible spectrum and into the shortwave infrared. And every lighting technology has a unique spectrum. And so you can identify what kind of light you're looking at, CFL, LED, incandescent, and so on, just from the spectrum. And so we're able to do this on a broad scale. This is a very broad image of Manhattan, Empire State Building, Manhattan Bridge, and so on. Here's a blow-up of the Manhattan Bridge, and you can see that the necklace lights are sodiums, I think, and the roadway, no, sorry, the roadway is sodium, and the necklace is LEDs, as you can see from the spectra here. So this is interesting because you can see when people adopt more efficient lighting technologies, you can quantify what's called rebound, which is the phenomenon of if I gave you more efficient lights, you might leave them on more often, partially negating the efficiency effect, things of that sort. Obviously, if you're selling energy efficient lights, this is interesting marketing data that you could use. Like this one, another imaging system. Electrical grids in this country flicker at, run at 60 hertz, so the current goes up and down every 1/60th of a second. In Europe and most of the rest of the world, it's 50 hertz. And what that means is that your lights, almost all of your lights, flicker at twice that rate, at 120 hertz. And it's quite easy to build a pretty simple camera system that will observe the flickering of every light that you see in the scene. And there are interesting things you can learn from that. The first thing you can learn, oops, sorry, let's go back. Can we go back one? Sorry. Yeah. The first thing you can learn is the grid frequency. This is the variation of the grid frequency over 2.5 days. Here is the nominal 120, and you can see, you know, it's not exactly 120. Many people know this, and you can build in situ devices that measure this. All that the power company guarantees is that there are a certain number of cycles within 24 hours, but not whether those cycles are equally spaced or not. And you can see there's quite a bit of variation. More interestingly is that you can measure the phase of oscillation of every source that you see. And here's a standard image. We've concentrated on the lights in this building, which is about 1 kilometer away. And by measuring the phase, you can nicely segregate them into the 3 phases of a 3-phase electrical system, A, B, and C, as shown by the color coding. And then you can watch the variation at the few degree level over 8 hours of the phase of each of those lights. Why is that interesting? Because the phase glitches every time a new load comes on the system, or a new generator comes on the system, or the relative phase changes as your transformer degrades. And so it's a very interesting way, we think, of monitoring activity and monitoring grid health. Right. Infrared, how are we doing on time? I got a few minutes, good. This is an infrared image in the thermal IR, so about 10 microns, of the west side of Lower Manhattan. And here's the same image taken 2 minutes later, and here's the difference. So you can ask what changed over 2 minutes. Well, you see these plumes. People are burning something there, probably gas, and it's venting out the vents. But we got real interested in that one. What's that? So we have building ID, and we were able to geolocate it. Turns out it's that building, which is on the West Side Highway, near Google headquarters, actually, around 14th Street, 15th Street. And you see these cooling towers, 8 of them up on top of the building. So we were able to catch the cooling tower firing up. So just think about that for a second. You can stand, let's say, in Midtown, look out of all Lower Manhattan, and watch the HVAC systems of every building operating in real time. That's pretty interesting. Here's an example of that. There was a building vent about 400 meters away, and we just watched every 10 seconds. Here's the background pixel, and here's the vent operating. You can see it goes into a pretty regular cadence, and then it goes double cadence for a while, and then off again, and so on. So if you're interested in improving building efficiency, understanding HVAC operations, building occupancy, and so on, this is a pretty nifty way to do it. I think this is the last example I got. We were able to borrow an instrument called GBAS, which is owned and operated, it's operated and built by aerospace and owned by the Air Force. It's a hyperspectral long-wave imager from 7 to 13 microns in 128 channels, and we sat it on the west side of Manhattan for about a week and just watched. And this allows you to identify all the chemical plumes coming out of Manhattan. And we found Freon. Here's an example. Again, for scale, Empire State Building, in this case, is up there, is about 2 miles away. And boy, there's a lot of Freon 22. This is a chemical that you can't buy anymore. You may not build a refrigeration system that uses it because it's an ozone heater, but there's still lots of it out there. And obviously, you could find the leaks and where is it coming from if you wanted to do that. We like this one. Here's a time lapse of acetone. So you identify the acetone from its spectral signature. Let's see, could we get that to play? I think it'll play. Can you manually click on that? Yeah, all right, great, thank you. So this is about 4 hours. We saw it every afternoon. And you say, what the heck is that? Everybody thinks nail salon first, right? Nail polish. So we identified it as 677 Washington Street with the geolocation. You go to Google Maps and you see Couture Cleaners at 679 Washington Street. So they have on-site dry cleaning. And so pretty good, interesting economic proxy of the activities of this business. I really wanted to find a drug lab with this experiment, but we didn't. Probably the wrong neighborhood to be looking at. All right, let me close with a couple of sort of higher level points of trying to actually do some of this stuff. Data hoarding is terrible. I like to say the second most basic human urge is to hoard data. The academics do it for priority. Commercial enterprises do it, obviously, for commercial advantage. And government departments do it because of turf and the potential, perhaps, for embarrassment. There are lots of issues about data standards, data ownership, as Tariq already mentioned, who owns the data, who's allowed to do what with it, and so on. We found ourselves in the center spending an inordinate amount of time with lawyers and discussions with data holders about what we could and could not do with the data. Urban ontology, the city is composed of many different entities, people, vehicles, buildings, firms, organizations. We don't have a very good way of describing that yet. It's a good research problem. Just back on data standards for a minute. There are like 4 different ways of denoting a building in New York City. There's a building identification number, there's lat long, there's street address, there's borough block and lot, which the tax folks use, and so on. So reconciling all of that is a challenge. The integration of disciplines has already been mentioned. I mean, I show you some things that were astronomy heavy, but obviously behavioral factors come in, economics, some of the engineering disciplines. Putting that kind of team together is a real challenge within a university. Who are the customers? Tariq touched on this a little bit. City governments, you would think, and certainly in, let's say, more command and control societies, that's almost a given. But in the West, in most of the cities we think about in the developed world, city governments are generally not very forward-looking. They're not very well resourced. They have terrible procurement rules, and getting anything deployed or even demonstrated in a city government is complicated. Firms, well, obviously everybody wants the data. Citizens, we have so much data now. So I think it's going to be firms and citizens more than it will be city governments, at least in the West. Can it be profitable? I spent a lot of time, I'm not sure Honeywell was one of the companies, but many other companies of that sort, talking with people about how you could make money from this. And it wasn't obvious. Okay? The economic case is not there. One of the questions I think we'll talk about in the panel is, what's the killer app? Have we actually done anything yet in terms of smartness that is so compelling that everybody says, we got to have this? I don't know. Citizen acceptance. Privacy, we're starting to see backlash, or we have seen backlash in London, in New York. Look at all the problems that Sidewalk Labs is having as it tries to stand up its enterprise in Toronto. Very difficult. And then, of course, even beyond privacy, there's the issue of control. Who gets to determine my route or what my thermostat setting is and so on. I think these are really interesting, difficult human issues that go just beyond the geeky science and engineering that is so wonderful for many of us. So with that, thanks for your attention, and I'm sure we'll have more to say during the panel discussion.